Good evening. My name is Vicki King, and I'm the WOS program coordinator. And on behalf of the Washington Ornithological Society, I welcome you to our first one of 2022. And we're very glad you joined us tonight. And I'd like Elaine to give the land acknowledgement right now.
Tonight's gathering is broadcast from what birders refer to as the Puget Sound lowlands. We here acknowledge that this is the traditional home of the Coast Salish peoples, including the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish, who have stewarded these lands and waters with care for generations and are still here. Our enjoyment and study of birds and their habitats extend across vast and far-flung regions. In like fashion, let us also honor the place of indigenous peoples and their traditional territories everywhere.
Thank you, Elaine. And I have two announcements before we get to tonight's program. And the first relates to the next annual conference that's scheduled for June 9 through 12 in Spokane Valley. And many of you are already familiar with Northeastern Washington. You may recall the two past conferences that were held in the area and already appreciate the diverse array of habitats, the distinct terrain, and the regional flora and fauna in the area. Information about the conference facilities and the block of hotel rooms that have been reserved for the conference is available at the WOS website. And registration information about how to register and whatnot will be available 2 months in advance of the conference, so probably in April sometime. And we sincerely hope that we will be able to meet and bird together in this beautiful and interesting part of the state. So fingers are crossed. And the second announcement relates to the program at our next monthly meeting. As you may know, late last year, WOS members began to enjoy a wonderful new benefit, free access to Cornell Labs' Birds of the World. And on February 7th, Cornell Labs' Laura Hemmermeyer is going to join us by video conference to introduce us to this rich resource and to explain how we can take maximum advantage of all that Birds of the World has to offer. Please note that the time of this meeting on February 7th is going to be a half an hour earlier than usual. We'll start at 7 p.m. Our presenter is going to be presenting from New York, and starting at 10 o'clock her time and 7 o'clock our time is a better bet. Now for tonight's meeting, Planting with a Purpose to Bring Back Birds. The idea for this program grew out of the really worrisome news in recent years about sharp declines in the numbers of birds and of insects. But tonight's take-home message is not more gloom and doom. Instead, it's a positive message and offers all of us an opportunity to take actions in our own gardens, in our neighborhoods, in our communities that can help reverse these worrisome trends. And we're going to hear from three presenters tonight. Will be Professor Doug Tallamy of the University of Delaware. Second will be David Droppers. He is a moth enthusiast and a butterfly enthusiast. And third will be WOS member Neil Zimmerman, who's a lifelong birder who's going to share gardening for wildlife expertise. So our first speaker will be Professor Doug Tallamy. He's an entomologist and a wildlife ecologist, and he's the best-selling author of the book that sparked tonight's presentation, Nature's Best Hope. I first heard Professor Tallamy talk when he was the keynote speaker at the Washington Native Plant Society in April, and that talk inspired me to buy his book, Nature's Best Hope. And I kept rediscovering more talks on YouTube because I was looking for them. And each one is somewhat different, and they all offer so much that's rich. And I highly encourage anyone who's interested in his what he has to present to search out YouTube, because there's a lot there. The talk we'll see that we'll see tonight was the lead talk at a pollinator webinar in 2020 that was sponsored by the National Wildlife Federation's Gardening for Life program. This talk is 25 minutes long, and as you'll see, some of it focuses on the eastern half of the United States, where Tallamy has lived and taught for more than 30 years. And I chose this particular talk both because it includes most of the key points he makes in his longer presentations, but also because its relatively short length allows us to have the second half of our program focus on habitat relationships that are local and specific to the Pacific Northwest. And I hope you will enjoy and be inspired by this talk by Professor Tallamy that Elaine is now going to start showing.
Okay, folks, Mary was going to update you on the Garden for Wildlife program, and she will when I'm finished. And then she was going to introduce me. I'm Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware. And my job today is to tell you what we know about keystone plants, how we learned it, where we go from here. And that is what I'm going to do. They are, I'm claiming, essential members of every single landscape. And my goal is to get everybody to know that so that we start using them more. The story really starts with E.O. Wilson, the greatest entomologist of all time, Harvard emeritus at this point, who wrote a paper way back in 1987 called The Little Things That Run the World. And he was talking about what would happen if planet Earth were to lose the insects that he claims run the world. And his message was very simple. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. If most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so radically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, even many of our freshwater fishes, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. And all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Unfortunately, we are now witnessing Wilson's predictions firsthand because we are, in fact, losing the little things that run the world. It's not by accident, folks. We are killing the little things that run the world. When I was young, and probably many of you as well, sites like this were common. You go on a substantial drive, and that's what your windshield used to look like. If you looked up at a street light, you'd see all the insects flying around it. Now we don't have to clean our windshields and you don't see anything flying around those lights. So it's anecdotal evidence, but there are people measuring it and the news is not good. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. And we're starting, we've worried more about pollinators than other insects because we worry about the honeybee. It's important. We worry about the monarch. So a number of our Midwest native bee species have disappeared from their historic ranges. There are 4 species of bumblebees that have declined 96% just in the last 20 years. So don't get excited about that as if that doesn't matter. They're not extinct, but they're functionally extinct. And that's the important thing. There are 3 species of bumblebees that may already be extinct. We haven't seen them in a long time. And 25% of our bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. News is even worse in Europe. 30% of Europe's orthopterans, the grasshoppers, katydids, and crickets are facing extinction. A lot of the data has come out of Germany that has lost 79% of its flying insects since 1989. There are 46 species of moths and butterflies that have disappeared entirely from Germany. This is the big one though. Invertebrate abundance, mostly insects, has declined 45% since 1974. And of course, as insects decline, all the things that require them, that depend on them, are going to decline as well. And we measure birds more than anything else because a lot of people like birds, but we got 432 species of North American birds threatened with extinction, not because there's only 5 left of each one, but because their population trajectories are headed down so steeply that that's the signal of impending extinction. There are now 3 billion fewer breeding birds today than there were, that should be 50 years ago. Those are gone already. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the group that said we've lost 3 billion birds, and divided those birds into the terrestrial birds into 2 groups. The birds that require insects at some part of their life history, mostly when they're reproducing, and the birds that don't, things like doves and finches that can reproduce on seeds Most baby birds cannot eat seeds, but a few can. Well, the birds that can reproduce on seeds are not disappearing. Their numbers didn't decline at all. But the birds that require insects have lost on average 10 billion individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as you take away the insects, the birds are going to suffer as well. And so many things are connected to insects that here's the UN's latest report. We're going to actually lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. That's a report, but I'll tell you, it's not an option. It's not an option to lose 1 million species. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen. Why? Why does it matter? It's the creatures that keep us alive. They're disappearing. Not good at all. Why are insects declining? Here are the major causes of insect declines. Insect declines have been called death by 1,000 cuts because there's so many different causes, but the misuse and overuse of pesticides is a major cause. Habitat loss, place to live in and food to eat, another major cause, of course. Plant choice, our choice of plants and the landscapes that we humans dominated. And then our plant choice has also led to the phenomenon that we call invasive species. These are plants that are displacing native plants in our natural areas almost everywhere. Light pollution, climate change, these are all impacting insects. I see good news here, believe it or not, and that is that pesticides, habitat loss, plant choice, and light pollution, spelled wrong, are all things that individuals can address. Invasive species and climate change, that's going to take collective action, but every one of us can address every one of these as soon as I stop talking. And tonight you can turn out your lights. So we can have a big impact. Let's right now focus on just one of those causes, and that's the impact of plant choice on insect declines. We've been studying this for, I don't know, at least 15 years now. I'll just share the results of one of our studies, but all the results say the same thing. We went into hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware and measured caterpillar communities in hedgerows that were invaded with non-native plants. So here's one with heavy autumn olive and multiflora rose and everything else in invasion, and compared the caterpillar populations to hedgerows that were not invaded. They were almost entirely native plants. And we found a 68% reduction in the number of species of caterpillars when they were invaded with non-natives, 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass, the actual amount of energy that those caterpillars are delivering to those hedgerows. So if you're thinking of caterpillars as bird food, we reduced bird food by 96%. It's not a surprise that our birds are disappearing. What if I said to you, introduced plants are reducing your bank account by 96%? I wouldn't have to explain that it's not a good idea to have all these introduced plants. And this is a result of poor plant choices on our part. Okay, we're not talking about bank accounts, but we're talking about insects. And insects are the currency in our ecological bank account. And it's our ecological bank account that keeps us alive. So it really is serious business when we look at the long term. In my view, the only viable option that we have is to live in harmony with the natural world that sustains us, to live sustainably in the natural world that sustains us. Because what's the alternative? Living unsustainably? That's not long term. How are we going to do that? Well, let's start where we actually live. 85% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. We can't ignore conservation on private property. So let's start by making wise plant choices right at home. It's the easiest piece of ground that we can manipulate. We don't have to get anybody's permission to choose plants wisely. Now we want to choose plants that are going to support the insects that run the world, but which insects should we be focused on? Well, there are a lot of insects in the world, 3 to 4 million species, most of them undescribed. We've got at least 164,000 described species in the US, but I tell you, I get undescribed species in my yard on a regular basis. So there's still a lot of undescribed species out there. We can't support all of them in our yards. So let's focus on two groups, the insects that maintain plant diversity and the insects that, of course, we want to maintain plant diversity because plants are capturing the energy from the sun and turning it into food. But then we also need the insects that take that food from the plants and deliver it to other animals. If the food stays locked up in the plant tissues, we don't have the other animals. So we're really talking about pollinators, and I don't have to explain this very much. People understand we need pollinators to pollinate our flowering plants. But the other group is caterpillars. And we'll focus on both these briefly here. Why do we need pollinators? Well, you hear all the time we need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. And I don't like that argument at all because, first of all, people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Which is not true. And it's also an incorrect figure. It's about 1/12 of our crops are pollinated by insects. Let's not think about our crops. Let's think about all the plants. 80% of our plants and 90% of our flowering plants are pollinated by animals, and those are mostly insects. So losing our pollinators is not an option. We would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Simply not an option. And we're not suggesting good land stewardship here. We're talking about essential land stewardship. Not having pollinators it's not on the table. We have to have them. Why do we need caterpillars? Well, caterpillars, they're the bread and butter of terrestrial food webs. They're the ones taking the energy from plants, the energy that's now locked up in plant parts, and transferring it to other animals. Most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat the insects that ate the plants. And it turns out caterpillars are transferring more energy than any other type of plant eater. So designing landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars is designing landscapes that have dead food webs, collapsed food webs. So a lot of people think, well, native plants are the solution to supporting both pollinators and caterpillars. And they're right, but there's a huge but in there. And that is that all natives don't support these insects equally well. So we have to be fussy about which natives we're choosing. We want to support the most insects with the fewest amount of plants. And what we have found is that just 5% of our native plants are supporting 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillars that are out there. And in terms of our bees, 1/3 of our native bees require particular plants to reproduce. This pattern is consistent. We've tested it in all parts of the country, all the different biomes, the different ecoregions. It doesn't matter what latitude you're at. It doesn't matter what the plant diversity is around you, whether you're in the north or the south, the wet zone or the dry zones. There are just a few plants that are doing most of the work in our ecosystems. And if you want the details about how we came up with all that, it's in this paper, Narango et al. Came out 2020, Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. So we're calling these plants hyperproductive plants. I mean, these hyperproductive plants we're calling keystone plants. You've heard that term before. Remember what a keystone is. This is a Roman arch. A keystone is the stone in the center of that arch. And if you take the stone out, the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of food webs, the food webs collapse because those plants are making the most of the food. So keystone plants are essential to sustaining both the caterpillars that are transferring energy from plants and the pollinators that are creating those plants to begin with. So I think about rebuilding the ecosystems in our yard as if you're building an ecological house. The keystone plants are the 2x4s in that house. They are essential. They're holding that house up. You can't build a house out of wallpaper. So we have to have them. They're not negotiable. And just to give you a few examples of how important they are, in most of the counties of North America, oaks are the most important keystone plant. They support 557 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic state. And think of these caterpillars as bird food, 557 species of bird food, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. But there are other keystone genera out there. Willows support 456 species in the mid-Atlantic states. Native prunus, things like black cherry, support 456 as well. They're tied with willows. So the number of them that are supporting a lot of species. What about other trees? Things like tulip trees only support 21 species. So clearly not a top producer, not a keystone plant. But if you don't have tulip trees, you don't have the tulip tree silk moth. So there are specialist insects that depend on tulip trees. Milkweeds, we're all planting milkweeds for the monarch. It only supports 13 species of caterpillars. Not a keystone plant. Does that mean we're not going to plant it? No, because if we don't plant milkweeds, we're not going to have the monarch. This is the dogbane flea beetle, or the dogbane beetle. It requires dogbane, of course. So it's another specialist on dogbane, and dogbane doesn't support a lot of insects either. So keystone plants support the most species, but to support host plant specialists, we need to use the plants on which all these insects have specialized. So let's go back to our house. We're building our house with these keystone plants. We need to flesh it out now, put in the walls, the wallpaper, and everything else, using plants that support the specialists. Then we have the bulk. We have that biomass of insects that we need to run the food web, and we also have the diversity of insects that we need to keep things in balance. How did we discover the keystone plant concept? Well, years ago, we looked at all of the plant genera in the mid-Atlantic states and went into the literature, over 4,000 references, and just wrote down which insects are eating which plants. We focused on Lepidoptera, moths, and butterflies because the host records for Lepidoptera are the best. And we came up with this list, and we ranked them. So here we have Quercus, 957. These plants here are supporting hundreds of species of Lepidoptera, whereas these plants are supporting tens or almost, or sometimes none. So again, we said, well, there's a real pattern here. These are the very, very strong producers. We're going to call them keystone plants. Note, keystone plants are categorized at the genus level. We've got the old Linnaeus said it was time to use a binomial system of classification where we use a genus followed by the species epithet. So if we're talking about oaks, the genus is Quercus. There are 91 species in this genus. So if you talk about the white oak, that's Quercus alba. That's just one single species. All of our listings here of plants, whether they're keystone or not, are at the genus level. So people say, well, are all species in a keystone genus equally good? And that's a real good question. So for example, is Quercus prinoides, the dwarf chestnut oak, as good at supporting caterpillars as is white oak, Quercus alba? And the answer is, we don't have the data that can analyze every species in a comparative way across the country. So the assumption is that if you're planting any member of a keystone genus, that's the best you can do in terms of supporting the caterpillars and the pollinators around you. So just assume that all members of a keystone genus are equally good. All native members. Non-native members are not equally good because they have not been in this country long enough for our insects to adapt to them. Another important point here, keystone plants only play keystone roles within their native ranges. I've got grandkids that live in Portland, Oregon. I spent a lot of time out there, and people in Portland, Oregon, landscape with it's got a very Mediterranean climate. So they landscape with plants from all over the world, including a lot of our eastern plants. They love red oaks. Well, red oaks are not native to Portland, Oregon. So we finally did an experiment comparing the insect use of red oaks in Portland, Oregon versus in Oxford, Pennsylvania, where I live. And there's a huge difference. The oaks in Oxford, Pennsylvania are supporting 4 times more insects than the oaks in Portland, Oregon. This is the same species, it's the same continent, but it is grown out of its native range in Portland, Oregon. So it's not being effective as the keystone species that it is here in Oxford. An important point. Why do we need plants that make so many caterpillars? Because it takes so many caterpillars to drive our food webs. You've all probably seen the statistic about chickadees, but there are actually many other birds where this has been done, looking at the number of caterpillars required to make a single clutch. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees, just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. And that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. That's why we need plants that make tens of thousands of caterpillars. This is one species. All the birds are doing that. So, you need hundreds of thousands of caterpillars to support even modest communities of birds in our neighborhoods. Other people ask, if I plant a keystone tree in my yard, will all of these caterpillars come and defoliate it? And I understand that question. But remember, everything wants to eat a caterpillar. So when you plant Yeah, no is the answer. When you plant a keystone plants, caterpillars will come and eat it, but so will all of their natural enemies. And they've got a ton of natural enemies. When the moth lays its eggs, right away you get little parasitoids laying their eggs in these eggs. It takes out a big percentage of those eggs before they even hatch. There are all kinds of parasitoid enemies, stachinid flies, lots of braconid, pneumonid flies, most of the wasps, wasps, things like yellow jackets and paper wasps and hornets, they are all predators and they're all eating caterpillars. So it's actually very difficult for a caterpillar to make it to adulthood. And that's why your trees are not going to be defoliated. When they are defoliated, it's typically by caterpillars that are invasive. They are non-native caterpillars like the gypsy moth, like the brown-tailed moth, like the winter moth typically from Europe or Asia, that are here without any of these natural enemies to keep them in check. So don't, we're talking about native caterpillars here, and they will not, under most circumstances, damage your plant in a way that you can even notice. And don't forget all those birds eating those caterpillars too, hundreds a day from each individual that is out there. All right, let's talk about pollinators now. How do we help pollinators? Well, Sam Droege has focused his research on native bees for a number of years now. He knows an awful lot about native bees, and he has recognized that a lot of our native bees are specialists, meaning they can only reproduce on the plants, the pollen of particular plants. And he says those are the plants we should plant. We want to meet the needs of our specialists, because the generalist bees can reproduce on any of the plants that the specialists are using as well. If you only plant for generalist bees, things like bumblebees and honeybees, then you're not supporting any of the specialist bees, and you have a depauperate pollinator community. Why have bees specialized? Because there's so many differences among flowers. They flower at different times. They look different from each other. They smell different from each other. Their pollen morphology is very different. These little nooks and crannies here on pollen grains are there for a reason. They're there. They have co-evolved with the spacing of the hairs on the legs and abdomen of the specialized bees that are really good at transferring pollen. So the pollen is going to cling to those specialist bees much better than the generalist bees, so that pollination is efficient. And specialization also happens because the nutritional value of these pollen grains differs so much. So you can actually specialize on particular types of nutritional value. So all these differences have opened the door for specialization. Here's a really important point. Bees do not specialize on nectar. Nectar is sugar water. And yeah, there's some differences in the amount of sugar, but it's the pollen they are specializing on. Most bees can use the nectar of any plant that they can access the nectar in. It depends on the length of their mouth parts. And that explains why we see bees, native bees and non-native bees, on non-native plants like butterfly bush. A lot of people plant butterfly bush and they say, well, there's butterflies on it and there's bees on it. It's a nectar supplier, but you don't see any specialized bees getting pollen from butterfly bush or zinnias or any of the other non-native plants that we see bees on. They're getting nectar, but they will not be able to reproduce when these plants are the only flowering plants that we have around. So keystone plants for pollinators do not support the most bees. They support the most specialist bees. So the focus is on the specialist bees. It's not on the total bee community, the generalists, because the generalists will use these plants as well. If you were to look across a number of the ecoregions in the country and to start ranking plants, these plant genera, starting with sunflowers, the various asters. Remember the genus aster was broken up into a number of genera. Goldenrods, willows, even all the way down to violets. These guys all support a whole great community of specialist bees. There are many plants that are supporting specialist bees, and a number of plants only support one or two species of specialist bees. And if you want those bees, you got to have those plants. But these are the ones that are going to support the most of them. And some of these plants also support the most caterpillars when you're comparing herbaceous plants. So goldenrod, for example, in the mid-Atlantic states, that supports the most caterpillars, 110 species. It's also a top plant in terms of supporting specialist pollinators. It's definitely one you want to focus on. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we choose plants wisely, we can increase the abundance and the diversity of both pollinators and caterpillars almost everywhere. So insect decline is a global problem, but it does have a grassroots solution. We created this problem, but I really believe that with keystone plants, we can solve it.
I don't know about you, but I had no clue about the important role that caterpillars play when birds are nesting. In one of his other talks, Professor Tallamy talks, he has some images that show a parent bird bringing caterpillars and stuffing it down into the mouths of their chicks. And he said you couldn't do that with beetles that have all kinds of sharp edges and whatnot. It would damage the babies, but the caterpillars are nutritious and they're soft, and they work very, very well. And I happened to sit in on a class that David Droppers offered on moths through Seattle Audubon. And after I discovered Professor Tallamy, I thought, oh my goodness, he would be a perfect person to come and talk to us about the role of moths and so many other things. And David has been teaching courses on topics from birds to butterflies and microorganisms and trees for many years to a wide variety of groups, including students who are studying biology and a variety of nonprofit environmental groups. And he's done a lot of work for the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the University of Washington, the Woodland Park Zoo, and others. And as you will soon see, he is enthusiastic about sharing his passion for the natural world with others who wish to learn. So I would like to invite David to take the podium now.
All right. So just to confirm, either Elaine or Vicky, can you confirm that you're seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes, it's fine.
All right, perfect. So, after Doug Tallamy's presentation, or what I watched of it, I did go to the National Wildlife Federation, the Keystone Plants list that they made, just to kind of see, hey, what do they recommend? Let's see. There we go. And what you'll find when you go there is you'll find this multicolored map of North America. It's divided into all the different bioregions, ecozones, whatever you want to call it. And notice that it lists us. Well, I should say us. I say Washington is listed as 3 different ecoregions. We've got marine West Coast forests. We've got North American deserts, largely confined to the Columbia Basin. And then we have northwestern forested mountains. And so, since I live in Linwood, I looked at the Marine West Coast Forest list and say, hey, what's on their list? Does it confer nicely with the list that I've made for, I primarily focus on butterfly gardening, but because nobody's really asking about moth gardening, but now that you've heard the importance of moth gardening in reference of caterpillars to attract birds, hey, people all of a sudden saying, hey, how do I attract the most moths now? So I wanted to see how their list compared to mine. Now, I need to tell you guys that the Western North America differs greatly from Eastern North America. Most of Doug Tallamy's work is from Eastern North America. A lot of the plants they mention and talk about, the concepts in his books still apply over here, even though the plant list might vary quite a bit. Now, those of us living in Washington even know that Western versus Eastern Washington is entirely different. So I was surprised when I looked at some of these keystone plant lists to find some that didn't quite make sense. Remember, we're going to revisit Doug Tallamy's point about, it starts by making the wise plant choices at home. So I look on the list for the marine West Coast forests, so those of Western Washington, and I find some suggestions of like this Rudbeckia, the Western coneflower, Rudbeckia occidentalis. I first met this plant during my year in Walla Walla. I'd go up into the Blue Mountains. This was a common plant. There were certainly many butterflies on it, many pollinators, but I was a little confused as to why this was a suggestion for marine West Coast forest. You look at the range of this of this plant is pretty much extreme eastern Washington, the Blue Mountains. There might only be a couple of records from Lewis and Wahkiakum County. I'm not exactly sure about that, but this is clearly not a widespread plant. It says here it services 29 specialist pollinators for larvae, but I don't think this is a good choice. It's not just that one. Coreopsis. There's a ornamental Coreopsis I planted in my first butterfly garden. I'm thinking I know that plant well. They have Plains Coreopsis on here. It provides services for 22 specialist pollinators. It's pretty much only an Eastern Washington plant. So if you're maybe in the foothills or if you're part of the Columbia Basin, this might be good, but this was part of the list for Western Washington. So am I saying that these lists are complete garbage? Absolutely not. There's some really good suggestions in here. I just kind of wanted to preface these lists with caution. You'll find a lot of suggestions. Just be sure to reference it back and say, hey, am I actually using a plant that's near here? Because remember Tallamy's point, keystone plants only play keystone roles in their native ranges. So I don't expect this Plains Coreopsis, I don't expect Western coneflower to be serving as keystone pollinator sources in marine West Coast forests. Now, I mean, this is a really tough job making these lists for these different regions, and I expect them to be much better in Tallamy's home area than, say, over here. We are topographically diverse compared to a lot of the East Coast. But so we revisit some of these stats, these reduction of species, reduction of abundance, reductions of biomass, and that's kind of what you're going to get if you keep putting plants that don't necessarily belong here, things like the Coreopsis coneflower, for example. By the way, I checked the list for the Columbia Basin. I checked the list for northwestern forest and mountains. Same problems exist there. Once again, a really difficult task to do. But so here's some more data from his book, Bringing Nature Home. So once again, caterpillar biomass, you can see so much higher on native plants versus aliens, even generalist biomass. We talked about the generalists, they'll pretty much use anything, but even the generalists really seem to prefer the natives over the aliens. And remember, this is all about providing bird food. That's what we're trying to do here, bringing back the birds by basically providing them with the full dinner plate. So once again, not bashing the lists in no way. There's a lot of really good suggestions on there. Just be sure to reference it back. You can use the USDA plants database. You can use your plant guides, whatever you need. But we really are trying for something that's more native to your local zone. Now, speaking of our local zone, Tallamy loves oaks. He's written an entire book about oaks, and oaks are really, really good elsewhere. This is my case against oaks, at least in Washington. We have one native oak I know of, unless you count the chinkapin oak, which barely gets into Washington. I think there might be a couple others that barely reach. I'm not sure. I'm not an oak specialist. But this is the range of the Gary oak on the West Coast. Now, we have a number of oak specialists on the West Coast. The problem is they really don't get up into Washington. So we have two butterflies in our region that specialize on. We have the Purpureus dusky wing and the California sister. But look at their ranges. The Purpureus dusky wing at least kind of snakes up the east side of the Cascades, stopping in the central area. We have some down in the Puget Prairies, and there's a couple of colonies on the islands. But if I'm going to plant my oak in my backyard in Linwood, I should not expect to get Purpureus dusky wings. Notice that the California sister kind of peters out right about the border of Washington, Oregon, even though the oak continues all the way up into the islands in southern Vancouver Island. A number of moth specialists do the same thing. We have Orthosia ferrigera, pretty much peters out right about the border, still kind of snakes up the eastern side. Nadata oregonensis, a specialist on oaks, right around the border. Agira fibularis, right around the border. They just kind of stop, even though the range of the Gary oak continues north. So this is my case against oaks. If you're looking to provide for the specialist oak feeders, they're just plain not going to get up into much of Washington. Now, if you live in Yakima, oh, go for it. Plant oaks, that's a great range for you. You live in Goldendale, plant oaks, that's a great range for it. But if you live in Seattle, if you live in Bellingham, if you live in Spokane, oaks are not going to be your key player here. Instead, you're going to go for your native plants. So if you're in Spokane, maybe like ponderosa pine would be a good one. If you're in Seattle, your alders, your native cherries like your prunus and marginata, things like that, your willows, those are going to be your key tree players. And especially if you do plant oaks, or if you plant these other plants, you're still going to have the generalist feeders feeding on them as well. Things like your silk moths and some of your arabids. So this kind of reminds me of back when I first started butterfly gardening. We have this very healthy cedar in our backyard. And I was just waiting, as a younger butterflyer, waiting for a cedar hair streak to show up in my yard. Well, while the West Coast cedar, Western red cedar is a host plant of the cedar hair streak, the cedar hair streak is habitat restricted. It wants a forest of Western red cedar. So one Western red cedar does not cedar hair streak habitat make. A lot of these specialists are not just restricted to oaks as their host plant, but they're restricted to oak woodlands. So even if you put one oak in your yard, that is not going to be habitat for them. Another case against oaks, so to speak. But the good news is it's not just oaks. So these are just some of the rough numbers of moth species compared to butterflies. So worldwide, we got about 160,000 species of moths compared to only about 20,000 species of butterflies. In Washington, the disparity is even more. We have about 160, give or take, depending on your taxonomic view. We have over 3,000 species of moths. So the good news is plant native plants, because if you plant a native plant, chances are there's one, two, probably more moths that are using it, and the more moths that use it, the more caterpillars are going to be there. Now, of course, your trees and shrubs are your best bet for caterpillars here. But if it's a native, I guarantee there's some moth caterpillar munching on it, and therefore going to be attracting birds. This is kind of one of my primary messages to people looking for restoration. It might sound a bit bittersweet. I say it's bittersweet laced with optimism. To me, the only constant in this world has changed. There has never been a period of time on our planet that has been stable. A lot of people who want restoration, who want to provide for wildlife, their goal is to go back in time and to get our habitats how they were, let's say, 250 years ago. There is no going back to that. But we have influence in how the future is going to look. So, for example, this is an example. Ceanothus, if you live east of the Cascades, great caterpillar host, great pollinator source, great native plants. Ceanothus doesn't really grow on the west side. It's too wet for it. However, there's one native Ceanothus from California and Southwest Oregon called Thysophloris. It's blue. It's gorgeous. It gets big. It can tolerate our rain okay, so long as you provide it with some good drainage. If you want to see it in action, go in April, early May to the parking lot at the UW, the Unibay Natural Area, Montlake Phil. There's a row of it, and you'll just see it humming with pollinators in the spring. I got a very strange record earlier this year saying I have caterpillars on my Thysophloris in West Seattle. Who are they? What gives? They were caterpillars of the California tortoiseshell. This is a butterfly that you can find in Western Washington in late fall. They'll overwinter here. They'll overwinter all over the state, but they'll overwinter here. You'll see them again in early spring as they fly around, but then they go immediately east. They go east. They want to find Ceanothus. That is their one and only host plant. And all the Ceanothus is in the east. Well, you had a female California tortoiseshell wake up. She was mated. She found some Ceanothus in West Seattle, and she said, hey, works for me. So we could potentially have urban populations of California tortoiseshell. Very cool. We have influence in how our native animals are going to change their use of the landscape. Now, once again, change is something that a lot of people, we want to change it back to what it was. And I say, hey, change is the only constant. Milkweed, for example, we have no monarchs on the west side. There's just no milkweed. But milkweed is a great nectar source, and our big native Asclepias speciosa does well in garden settings over here. So my key message here is, how do we want nature? Now, my argument is that everything is nature. We just happen to make a new habitat called urban and suburban. So I'll define it as our habitat. How do we want our habitat to look? We do have influence over how it's going to look. Right now, our group, this presentation is all about, let's get rid of the monoculture lawns. Let's get some diversity in there, some native plants. And we can potentially get a lot more insects, a lot more birds, and just a lot more life in our yards. I'm someone who is paralyzed by, I need something perfect before I start. And I've learned to stop waiting. I know enough to get started. So do you. It doesn't have to be perfect. Throw a native plant in there. You've made progress. Whether that's a shrub, a small tree, or just even a strip of native wildflowers. And start experimenting and watching. The West Coast in particular needs more data. There's a reason why the East Coast, they seem to have everything together, and that's because they have far more people, far more data, and far more years, honestly, of doing this. In the West, we have very little data here, so I need you guys to plant plants, look for caterpillars, look for sign of caterpillar damage, watch for bird use of the plants, and and report this, because it's with more data we're going to find out what exactly our keystone plants are. I mean, we have plenty of suggestions, but I'm guessing that our keystone plants, as far as how many caterpillars they host, that list is very incomplete. Now, I'm pretty sure that things like alders, prunus, willows, I'm pretty sure they are keystone plants. They are. But as far as ones that might only host 8 caterpillars, according to the literature, might actually host a lot more than we think. And we're only going to figure that out by experimentation and watching. So just get those native plants in there. You know enough to get started. It doesn't have to be perfect. So with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. And then I will turn it over to Vicki, who will then turn it over to Neil.
Thank you very, very much, David. And I was going to mention a document that is available at the WASP website that offers resources. And one of the resources it offers is a butterfly gardening list that David provided to us. And he said that many of the plants in that list are used also by moths. So I'll come back to that document in a little bit, but there is some help there. There is some specific advice about plants we can use.
I apologize. I would like to make one comment. So that was made for a presentation for gardening for butterflies. If I were to do a moth list, some of those plants would absolutely be in there, but it would have some additional plants in there. So just note that. It's certainly not going to be a bad list if you're just trying to get caterpillars and get birds in your yard.
Thank you very much, David. And now for the final portion of our program, I would like to introduce Neil Zimmerman. And many of you may know Neil. He's been in the birding community for almost 50 years. He's been a longtime volunteer for Seattle Audubon in particular, and his services as a board member, as a trip leader, and in so many other ways earned him Seattle Audubon's prestigious Hero of the Pack Award in 2018. And for decades, Neil has given presentations for Seattle Audubon about attracting wildlife to backyards. And he's still involved with teaching people how to make urban areas more wildlife friendly. And tonight, Neil is going to share some ideas from his own gardening experience, and he'll show photos of the beautiful garden that he and his wife, Carlene, have created. And with this, I'll turn it over to Neil.
All right, thank you. I'm going to get see if we get the screen up here quite right. See, I seem to be off here a little bit. That's not it. Elaine, can you help me?
all I can do is take back the presenter if you need to start over.
Yeah, let me start over. I clicked
Sure.
probably on the wrong thing.
All right. And here we go again. There we go.
Your screen is up, Neil.
Okay, can you see the whole, can you just see one slide, or you can see everything on the left-hand side?
We
can
are
only
not seeing it in presenter view if you could find that button, but if you can't, we'll live.
Well, I don't know. It worked great when we started out, so you may have to just kind of bear with me here a little bit. So you can see the nuthatch though.
Neil, may I make a suggestion? If you go below the Seattle Audubon Society icon, do you see the bottom 4 icons there? Bottom right?
Bottom right. No, I don't.
Seattle, so you're not seeing what we're seeing. I'm sorry, I can't click it for you.
Well, we may just have to go. If you can see the main slide there, we'll just have to go with that.
Would be fine. Thank you.
Okay, so this would be a hard act to follow here. I guess these guys know a lot more about insects than I do, but I have been given this program, Attracting Birds to Yard, for over 20 years for Seattle Audubon. So what I want to talk about tonight to kind of finish things up is the practical way to get started on this stuff. Like David said, quit waiting, get started. So I just kind of want to go on to things that we can do to improve your backyard. So this is the traditional gardening, nice and clean. This is a house down the street from us. Not my kind of gardening at all. But this is our front yard here. You can see that we've pretty much got rid of the lawn. I haven't owned the lawnmower for about 25 years. I learned a lot of this stuff by going to the Flower and Garden show. I found it to put in paths and raised beds. I have a mixture of natives and non-natives, but no lawn and a lot of plants. So one of the things that I always talk about is rules here, and the first one is stop using chemicals. I'll talk about this in a minute. Stop cleaning up and plant more plants. So as you all know, pesticides are harmful to more than just the harmful bugs. A lot of the bugs are beneficial, and if you start using pesticides, you're going to be killing the bugs as well as the birds. I think I'm kind of speaking to the choir here because I think most people here know that pesticides are very harmful. And one thing you can do is stop cleaning up. I have a electric weed yard back that also is a mulcher. It mulches up the oak leaves. So one of the areas that I've done where I've rehabilitated some stuff is that I've taken that mulcher and sucked up these. I have a huge oak tree out front, suck up these leaves and started piling them up as mulch, because the mulch will work as keeping the moisture in and keeping the weeds down, but it also provides an important place for the insects to be, because you all have seen a lot of birds that are foraging in the leaf litter. So underneath all my plants, as much as I can, I try to get leaf litter going so that it harbors the insects. And you've seen the fox sparrows and towies and juncos. They're out there rooting around the leaves. The fox sparrows especially are pretty cool. They kind of do a little kickback and they look down to see if they've unearthed anything. So a leaf litter underneath your plants is very important also. And like our last two speakers have talked, native plants are the way to go. There's a saying in the plant world, is the right plant for the right place. So if you're going to plant something, it's always a good idea to do a little research. Make sure that the sun or shade requirements are met, the moisture requirements. But the native plants that we have in our area have adjusted to our dry summers, wet winter, and they're also beneficial to the native insects we have. And a lot of people, when they, in the fall time, when they seeds are done or the flowers are done, they go back and clean and cut everything back. Really what you want to do is clean up your yards in the springtime. Leave these seed heads out there so that the insects can feed on them. And then the birds will come in and eat the seeds. Almost anything that goes to seed will be eaten by the juncos and the different seed eaters that come to your yard. So, and the more plants you have, the more bird diversity. So this is another picture of our front yard. You can see I don't have all natives. When we moved in, we had this big rhodie on the right-hand side that I cut back down almost to the ground about every 5 or 6 years because it gets so big. But I have a lot of other plants out there that attract a lot of birds. And really, this area right in here, I call that the thicket because I have some rose hips in there and a lot of plants. It's so thick. That's my towhees and my song sparrow's nest, and it's kind of keeps the cats out. So a lot of people ask me, how do you get started? So what I like to do is, this is kind of what our yard was. I live in Briar, Washington, which is about 1.5 miles north of Lake Washington. And we only live, our yard isn't huge. It's a 1/3 of an acre. And when our kids got big enough where that they were no longer playing in the backyard, I wanted to just get rid of the lawn. And this is kind of what I had. There was an old dog kennel here, some bare dirt, grassy area. So I kind of wanted to do something different. So what I kind of did is my kids kind of helped me come up with a little plan here. And one thing I learned at the flower and garden shows is to put in paths. That paths just attract people to wander your yard. You don't have to say anything. When people go in my backyard, they just automatically start wandering the yard. And I originally wanted a pond in the back here, but I realized soon that I would have to dig it, put it in, and maintain it. So I decided to go with a dry stream bed. But I surrounded by native plants. And what I try to do is, my neighbors have some plants up against the fence, so I try to plant plants up against there. Because that way you kind of get double your money. You have plants on both sides of the fence that the birds go back and forth. You really don't want your yard to be in an island if you can help it. You want to be able to use the plants that your neighbors have if they have any. So this is kind of how I started out here. Grass is notoriously hard to get rid of. And the front yard, I tried to dig it out and covered it up with weed barrier and put on bark. But in the back, I put in a dry stream bed here, just dug kind of a trough, brought in like 4 tons of river rock. And I put a path in around the outside, and I put down 6 yards of crushed gravel or crushed rock. But to get rid of the lawn and to put in the plants, I started putting in the plants, and I started putting newspaper and then later on cardboard over the top of the grass. And I brought in dirt. I put about 3 inches of black dirt on top of the cardboard. So as things go along, the cardboard newspaper basically breaks down, and so does the lawn. And you can still plant through that really easy. It's not trying to dig through plastic or something like that. So it works really good to get rid of the lawn. And then this is kind of what it looks like in my backyard. Now, this was actually about 10 years ago. You can see the irises. They're not native, but my next door neighbor gave me irises, and they kind of look nice. But I have a lot of other stuff in here. Red flowering currant. I have yew trees, salal, a lot of native plants in the backyard. And then when you start to plant, you want to kind of think about the layers. As we all know as birders, that birds like different layers in your backyard. So when you start planting, you want to kind of consider the height of some of your plants and how they will grow. The hardest one really is the upper canopy, because it's pretty hard to plant a big tree and have it grow up, and by the time you're frankly still alive, because they take so long to grow. But there are a few that are native plants, like the western hemlock or western red cedar and the hemlocks. They actually grow pretty fast compared to some of the other trees. So I've got a few of those in my yard. Years ago when I got started, a lot of the books were how to attract cardinals, how to attract rose-breasted grosbeaks, because all the books had this Eastern bias. But this book came out quite a few years ago, and this is by Russell Link, and he is a local non-game biologist who wrote this book. So this book is really a great resource for finding out about Washington plants or Pacific Northwest plants. And the state for years had this program called Backyard Wildlife Sanctuary Program. Recently, it's been changed for Habitat for Your Yard. But they give you a lot of information, the things you can do, Western Washington plants. But they also give you can get this little sign. And I like the little sign because I've striken up several conversations with people walking by and asking me about the sign. And also my neighbors don't think I've completely gotten lazy and I don't clean up anything anymore because I actually have a plan. About 10 years ago, across the street from us, they clear cut about 12 acres back there and put in 29 homes. And that really got me thinking about things to do in my yard. And that yard across the area across the way there used to have western screech owls. And I used to hear those screech owls for years over there and occasionally see them in my yard. But when they came in and clear cut it all, I wanted to do something. So I put in a couple boxes. So now 4 times out of the last 8 years, I've had western screech owls nest in my backyard. It's an old flicker box. So I always think of this as kind of reward for all the work that I've done in my yard to try to keep things so that the birds and the other wildlife can have some little oasis to come to. So like David said, get started. You don't need to wait. You don't have to do your whole yard. I went crazy in our yard. I got rid of every lawn and stuff. Start at the outside. Start working your way in. Start putting in some of the plants that you like. And over the time, you may or may not get rid of your lawn, but at least work around the outside and put in plants that will be beneficial to your wildlife. Because as you know, as you look around, especially here in Briar, which used to be a very rural area, they are clear cutting at an amazing rate and putting in houses. So this is my way to kind of help provide for the plants and wildlife. So that's kind of my wrap up. I wanted to not go on too long. So I guess now I'll give it back to Elaine.
Neil, thank you so much. It was wonderful to see the progression from where you started to where you are now and what you've accomplished over the years. And I've had the good fortune to visit their garden that he and his wife, the artist, you can see some of her early art created in their yard. It's a wonderful place that attracts warblers and so many other species that really enrich their lives. He didn't mention the catio they have, where their cat is able to look out at their garden, but can't go out and harass the birds that are there. So thank you, and thank you, David, very much for participating and sharing your considerable expertise with us. And I'll just mention again this document that is, if you go to the WOS website under birding resources, the final entry in the list is a list of resources, and it includes books like Russell Link's book. And as I mentioned, it has the butterfly garden design that David created some time ago. It also has links to lists of all the nurseries in the state of Washington that sell native plants and some other resources. So if you're eager to get started, hopefully if you go there, you might find something that would help get you on your way. And I certainly would like to put in a plug for the native plant organizations here in the state that have been carrying this torch for a very long time, and I think would be happy to share their expertise if you want to get started. So at this point, I invite anybody who has questions that we might be able to answer. Obviously, Professor Tallamy's not here. I will mention at the end of his book, Nature's Best Hope, he has about 20 pages of questions and answers. So if you can get your hands on a copy either at a bookstore or in the library, I highly recommend any way you can get information from him, either from a video or in written materials. It could well be worth your while. So now open it up to any questions you have.
Vicki, this is Elaine, the voice out of the blue. May I mention, first of all, thank you, Vicki, for all you poured heart and soul into putting this great collection of speakers and concepts together. I mean, I'm the first, maybe Jim and your husband's the first witness to how much work you've put into it, but thank you very much. I have a couple of questions to read to you. And meanwhile, if some of you have not already done so, please take a look at the chat. There are some nice pasted in URLs, websites that you can copy yourself. Apparently, the last one I put in isn't working, but it was said to be a free download to that Russell link, Landscaping for Wildlife of the Pacific Northwest. But let me
Yeah,
go.
I clicked on it and my my Norton said I was being maliciously attacked. So
Well, thank you for helping us to realize that. But let me go to the head of the class, which I call Shelley Evans of the Native Plant Society. Shelley, start thinking on your behalf of your group, your wonderful group. I hope we can get some clues from you as well. But here's a question, a very apropos one. Neil, when you mentioned mulching leaves and so on, Carolyn Boatsman wondered if we grind up those down leaves, will we be killing the insects or their larvae or their eggs that are overwintering in those leaves?
Well, it kind of depends. The ones that I grind up I have a huge oak tree out front, and not a native oak. It's a pin oak, but it's a monster one. And I typically try to get them up off the ground, because if not, they cover up my driveway and everything else. So I guess there's probably some that are wintering on there, but I know there are a lot of insects that winter in the leaf litter. And so I'm trying to recreate that leaf litter, that maybe I may lose some that are on the leaves, but I think there's going to be a lot of other plants or other insects that'll be using the leaf litter uh, as a way to winter.
Excellent. Neil, I wanted to ask, it's lovely looking, that area that you call the dry stream bed. This is a visual fun thing for you. You don't actually run water through it, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, that comes from going to the flower and garden show so many times. You see all these dry stream beds, and it really looks nice. Sometimes when it looks wet, but I didn't show it. But at the very bottom of the dry stream bed, I do have about a 10-foot little false stream that runs down, and that's really, I should have mentioned water as one of the things that you can do, because especially in our area, and this last year when it was so dry at the end of the summer and early fall, we have a lot of birds that came to the water that would not normally come to feed on any of the plants or anything like that. So water is an important part. But the dry stream bed is just a visual, and it looks nice, kind of a centerpiece for the whole backyard.
Excellent. Those are our Habitat 4 corners: food, water, shelter, and space. Here's a question that is very apropos. Thank you, Dick. Sorry, when someone puts a message in, it makes it jump and then I lose it. Has there been any issue in your yard and landscaping philosophies that lead to attracting rats or squirrels or other things that we probably don't want quite as many of?
Is that my question?
That was to Neil, or either of you, either Neil or David, but it was to Neil. Does your yard and landscaping philosophies attract rats or squirrels or others?
Well, squirrels, rabbits, raccoons, those are wildlife I don't have a problem with. The rats, I do get rats, but I do try to squirrel proof all my feeders, and I have trays underneath them, which keeps the rats down. I try to keep things cleaned up, but then again, I live trap the rats so that I don't like to use a killing trap, because I want something that I can decide who's going to die or not. And I actually do trap and I drown the rats.
All right. David, do you have a local native plant list that you can share with us? We'd be glad to make that an addition to the resource that Vicki has put on the WOS website.
So there's the one I gave Vicki. If you go to the Washington Butterfly Association website, there's a tab called Butterfly Gardening, and then there's the Puget Sound butterflies and their food plants. Now, once again, this is for food plants because nobody's asked me to put on a gardening for moth program. And largely the reason why, you garden for moths, at least for this group, would be to garden for bird food is what I call it. But once again, as long as you're putting in the native plants, if you follow the suggestions in there that for butterflies, there are a number of moths that also use those plants. If you want, I'm typing my email into. I'm also not hard to find online, but I'm typing my email into. Oh, whoops! I need to make it to everybody.
While you're doing that typing,
I'm typing my email into the chat box, and if you have specific questions regarding, if you're trying to get more moths, basically trying to get more caterpillars, shoot me an email.
Thank you. We are also a little bit heavy on the west side of the state, but could we get some help with identifying keystone plant species for eastern Washington? If that's not at the tip of your tongue, David or Neil?
So one of the ones that, because I told you I did look at the plant list, the suggestions for the other side. Rabbit brush, your buckwheats are killer out there. Sagebrush, if you got space for sagebrush, plant some sagebrush. Bitterbrush, I think that's I can't remember the Persia, I think. Lupins, if it's a bit more wet, are great for butterflies and moths and native pollinators. It's, in my opinion, it's a lot easier to garden over there because it's a lot of our hosts on the west side are these giant trees, like Neil said. Yeah, western hemlock and Douglas fir are great, but God, did they take forever? Then they take up your entire yard.
I'm going to do a little translation for some of us older folks. When he said it was killer, he meant that was good.
No.
Rabbit bush, sage, of course, sagebrush.
So let's see. I'm just going to type them in really quick.
And for those of you who haven't discovered the chat area, it's really good to be able to check there. There are these lovely resources with URLs, websites that you can just copy and or just click on and they'll open in your browser. Another question, what resources are useful for researching plants, my gosh, for specialists rather than generalist insects? If anyone has. And by the way, I just have to tell you, this is a question from a person whose lovely name is Flora.
It's a really good question because, so pollinators or specialist insect pollinators, namely these specialist bees, that is not my specialty. So the short answer is I don't know. But if you Google Sam Droege, who was mentioned in the Tallamy video, I'm sure you're going to find it. There's plenty of, there was a recent book called The Bees in Your Backyard, which would be another really good resource. The Xerces Society makes a good gardening for pollinators guide, so that would be another resource to go for.
Thank you. Question about vine maple. Question about vine maple. Is vine maple a good, maybe not exactly keystone, but a good shrub?
Before I answer that, Vicki, you had a question?
Well, I just wanted to volunteer something that you said in that class, which really I was amazed by, which is just how prevalent moths are in our backyards. And because they're out at night, most of us don't see them. But you mentioned, I mean, there could be hundreds in in a yard.
I guarantee you that Neil has at least 300 species of moths in his backyard. Guarantee. 300 species.
Even though we don't know they're there.
They're there. They're totally there.
Well, I know they're there because I have a porch light, and there's always moths cruising around the
Yep.
porch. Always.
So to answer Helen and Henry, are vine maples a keystone? So once again, so remember what Doug Tallamy said about his keystone list. The keystone plants are identified to genus level, mostly because we don't know if one species is better than the other. And Acer, the genus of maples, is on that list, and it should be for marine west coast forests. They give examples like the big leaf maple, but vine maple is great because, like, once again, who has space and time for a big leaf maple? But a vine maple is a total yard-friendly size maple, and I have had great success with finding caterpillars on it, both in urban areas and in wild areas. So I would answer a tentative because we don't have the data yet. But I would answer a tentative yes. If you've got space, vine maple is a lovely native plant that is very yard friendly.
Excellent.
Yeah, I have a couple vine maples, and I really like them because they have those great maple helicopter seeds, and I've seen a lot of birds eating on those seeds. But one thing I will say is that when I use that leaf back, one year when I first started doing that, I sucked up a bunch of vine maple leaves and stuff, and I'd literally planted 10,000 vine maples in my yard, which was not a good idea. So I normally recycle those in the green container, but they're great plants, great colors, and they don't get huge and they grow relatively fast. But I see all kinds of birds in there all the time, and they're gleaning insects off of it.
And yep, they're going for caterpillars. Yep.
I have a nice comment from our newest board member, Dave Kreft. Dave has put in a Inland Northwest Pollinator Plant Guide reference in the chat. If anyone hasn't figured out how to get to the chat, let us know, but the URL, the website is listed there. You can click on it. Rockhopper, where do you live? Rockhopper is writing that he or she doesn't have a backyard with anything but rhododendrons sparsely planted, no ground cover at all. What would be the best way to start a ground cover for the dirt? I want to plant a bunch of wildlife friendly plants, but first want to try to get the ground covered.
I would just start by putting leaves over the top. You don't have to buy a leaf back to chop them up and mulch them up, but just start covering them with a leaf and start working on a leaf litter underneath. And then you can decide, keeping an idea, the different layers you want. You can put in some of if it's a kind of a sunny area, like kinnikinnick's a native plant that flowers, have berries on it, is used a lot in commercial landscaping because it's so hardy. But you can put in salals, ferns, different plants. Ferns, they don't really offer a lot of whole food value, but they're a really good way to kind of start covering up parts of your yard and make the leaf litter more productive for insects.
I bet you have a lot of neighbors that would be glad to donate leaves to you if you'd go rake them up. Anyone else who's got a question, we're really pleased to try to field it. And again, Vicky's running the story here, but we will have our recording up as we have on every talk that has been given in this monthly series, thanks to Vicky's hard work. That is being asked in the chat. You'll be able to get a message if you're a member of WOS directly when it is posted. If you're not a member, you'll just have to keep checking the website on YouTube.
I will mention that list of resources I mentioned that is at the WOS website does have some references to King County, which has some planting guides that will make distinctions between whether it's a dry, sunny area or it's shady and damp. And they have specific references. The Washington Native Plant Society has a very rich website with lots of information on many, many, many plants, not only their names, but also where they grow well. And again, there's a lot of links to resources across the state, not just here in the West, that I hope will be useful for anybody who would like to, as this gentleman wants to start filling some of those bare areas up with things that would be more productive.
Well, if
And
the last thing you see is sketches by Carlene Zimmerman, that'll be a lovely thing to put you to sleep with.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, sleep, not
Oh,
as
okay.
in normal.
Well, the last thing I like to say is, and David said it, and I repeated it before, is don't wait. Because this time of the year is the time to start planting perennials and bushes and stuff and get them in the ground. So by the time spring comes, they've already developed some roots and get ready to go. And this year you don't have so many things in your yard up, and so it's easier to kind of plan things out. But you do want to do some planning and right plant in the right place.
Are there any other questions that anybody would like to pose or comments? Well, again, I thank our presenters very much for sharing their experience and expertise. And thank you all for joining us. And I hope you'll be inspired to look at your yard anew with fresh eyes and think about ways that we can make changes that are going to make it better for the wildlife that we would like to have back in our yards. And I guess I'll wish you a good night. And thank you so
very much, Vicki.
Good night.
Thank
Good night,
you.
all.
Good night.
Stay safe. Stay safe.